It's the Bird Emergency, the show where we talk about the disappearing birds around the planet and the amazing people who are learning about those birds, conveying that information to the general stooges, bird nerds of the world like myself, and the other conservation workers who are doing everything they possibly can to make these birds hang on. I'm Grant Williams. I'm a bird nerd. I'm not a scientist. But today, scientists, conservation workers, because it's the second helping of World Albatross Day. World Albatross Day, the June 19th. This year, I think the 20th anniversary of the worldwide signing of the convention to protect albatross, petrels, and shearwaters. But it's all albatross, all albatross, all albatross. Today, in this session, I'm talking to Dr. Lindsay Young, who's the Executive Director of Pacific Rim Conservation. We're about to find out all about that. And Federico Mendez from Conservacion de Islas, which is, in my lazy Australian English, conservations on islands. I think that's a good translation. So to kick it all off, Dr. Lindsay Young, could you please tell us all about Pacific Rim Conservation and how Pacific Rim Conservation is helping out our albatross friends? Hello, Lindsay. Oh, you're on mute, Lindsay. You're on mute. Oh, Lindsay's gone. Lindsay's gone. Federico, that means the floor's open to you. You're really focusing on the Black-footed Albatross project. So tell us about that.
Yes, for sure. Hopefully it's coming back because this is truly a national project, what we're doing with the Black-footed Translocation from Midway Atoll to Guadaloupe Island. And this been in the main, it has different approaches and different kind of edges. It's about saving a species from the impacts of climate change on its kind of primary colonies. And it's about getting new colonies on higher islands that are safe from different threats, say marine pollution, say invasive species like cats or mice, for example, as in many different islands that they are facing these threats. So we started talking about this probably a couple years ago, but really started working on it last year. And sorry about on the back, but we work with conservation dogs as well, so we'll tell you about it. So that's why you'll hear about them. So yeah, we started with this project, and within a global pandemic, finally we made it. So yeah, we can talk about what we've been doing for the Blackfoot on between the US and Mexico.
Right. Well, luckily we've got Lindsay back with us. Lindsay, let's go back to where we were. Pacific Rim Conservation. Tell us about this project.
Hi, where I am. So yeah, Pacific Rim Conservation, we are a nonprofit group based in Hawaii in the US, and we work to restore the habitats and populations of threatened and endangered bird species within Hawaii and across the Pacific. So for the last 6 years, what we have been doing is identifying seabird species that are at risk due to the effects of climate change. And in cases where we're able to, creating new habitat in places that are safe for them. And so what that means is from climate change or from sea level rise specifically, so on islands that are high enough to withstand projected sea level rise, and then making it suitable for them by either protecting them against predators through fencing or moving them to islands where there are no predators to begin with. And so this creates sort of safeguard populations. A lot of seabirds only nest in a few locations, and the more that have kind of the more you've spread out the risk between different. And in 2017, we added Black-footed Albatross. And then the years after, we've added Tristram storm petrel, bonnet petrel, a variety of species that are susceptible specifically to sea level rise. And what we realized, Laysan albatross have a decent number of colonies throughout the Pacific where they have now colonized on their own, including islands of population of Laysan albatross. On top of having 99% of their population nest below 2 meters in sea level, they also nest on the perimeter of atolls, so they're almost doubly susceptible to storm surge and rising seas. And so we began talking with GECI and Fede at folks in Mexico about expanding the range for Black-footed albatross. They are frequently seen foraging off of the west coast of the United States and Mexico and have attempted to breed in Mexico in the past, but were unable to sustain a colony. And so began about this. And then this year, we were able to successfully translocate both the eggs and chicks of Black-footed albatrosses to Mexico, which has been exciting.
Lindsay, can I ask you to comment on a couple of issues. Let's tackle climate change first. What kind of rise in sea level are you seeing already? Lindsay, are you there?
I'm sorry, I can't hear the question you're asking.
Okay, I'll throw that one to you again, Lindsay. Just on climate change, just wondering how much of a rise in sea level have you seen in recent years already?
We have seen pretty dramatic changes on the atolls we work in, specifically Midway Atoll and Turn Island in French Frigate Shoals. We often take chicks from the nests that are on the very edge of the beach where the next large set of waves that come in are going to take them out, sort of thing. And on one beach in particular that we work on in Midway, it's disappearing at a rate of several feet per year. So we sort of have seen it from year to year with our very own eyes. The nesting area we used to take the chicks from doesn't exist anymore. So it's rapid.
And for those species, are they nesting in sand scrapes or are they nesting in amongst tussocks of vegetation or in sort of pebble beaches? What are the nesting habitats?
The islands that they nest on have very little vegetation. There are some sort of low-lying shrubs and things like that, but mostly they are nesting oftentimes right on sand or just inland of the beach area where there's just essentially grass. So there's not a whole lot of vegetation in many of these places to hold it together. And in a lot of these islands, unfortunately, they were really heavily modified during World War II. And so in the case of Turn Island, there's a seawall that goes around the perimeter of the island. And that has accelerated the erosion that's happening for any of the sort of natural substrate that's left. So there's not a whole lot keeping these islands from just washing away into the sea.
We did have a bit of a connection issue with some of your answer, and you were talking about Laysan albatross. Can you just tell us again which albatross species your project is working on?
I'm sorry, I can't hear you. I was speaking about black-footed albatross prior to that.
Okay, so black-footed albatross and Laysan albatross. Are there any other albatross species that are breeding within your project's geographical area?
There are several pairs of short-tailed albatross. So the World Albatross species are in the southern oceans south of the equator.
Yep, so short-tailed albatross too. So just so some of the questions are more targeted at obviously the North Pacific because we've already talked about the subantarctic range in the Australia, New Zealand and UK territories already. So invasive species, Lindsay, what have you been dealing with? We're all familiar with rats and mice. Are there any other mammals or have you got weed species that you need to deal with as well?
Yeah, kind of all of the above. So we do have weed species that can crowd out the nesting habitat on Midway and Curie Atoll in particular. There's Verbicina, which is a crown flower. It's almost like a sunflower species that can grow up until it finally grows taller than them and they're unable to find ability to fly ground. So that invasive species in the form of mammalian predators is really the largest threat on land. None of the islands where these birds breed in the northern hemisphere would have had any sort of mammalian predators. And so in Hawaii, that is pigs, cats, dogs, mongoose, rats, and mice. Basically anything will eat these guys alive. And so it's really important to protect their breeding colonies against them. And a lot of the atolls in the northwestern Hawaiian Islands that hold the majority of their population are mostly free of invasive predators, with the exception of mice on Midway Atoll, which will soon be removed. But in the main Hawaiian Islands, the inhabited ones, we have islands that are tall enough to withstand sea level rise. They're loaded with predators. And so one of the strategies that we use to create these colonies on islands, where they have sort of a hood or a cap on top so they can't climb, a fine mesh that is small enough that even the smallest rodents can't get through, and then a skirt that's buried underneath so they can't climb through. So we essentially create these little sanctuaries for the birds, translocate them into them, and then have the predators removed so they have a safe spot to come back to.
Now, translocation is sometimes a controversial approach to take in conservation measures. Can you give us an idea, Lindsay, how long did it take to assess the potential viability for translocation? And was that a difficult decision?
Yes and no. Location specifically for other species beyond seabird can be controversial because there's the possibility that animals you're translocating can become invasive species themselves, especially if you're talking about assisted migration. But the unique thing with seabirds is that they have very distinct nesting habitats and foraging habitats. They basically don't eat anything when they're on land. They're really just using that 1 square meter plot where they are putting their egg and their chick.
Lindsay, I think we've lost you again. I might ask you, Lindsay, if you can hear us.
There's a lot of the albatrosses, or all the species that we are moving to new locations, are naturally found in the waters where we're translocating them. So we're not changing their foraging range. We're just providing them with an additional breeding island. So in terms of assessing go ahead.
No, I was just going to say that the sort of conflicts in translocation are minimal, you've told us, and apart from that square foot of land area of real estate, I guess the positive aspect for moving seabirds or reintroducing seabirds is that you're getting that guano effect too, so that you're actually encouraging, hopefully, indigenous remnant vegetation with the. Yep. Lindsay, I think we're having so much trouble. I might just invite you to. Lindsay's jumped out. She's obviously having terrible issues with her internet. If she does come back in, I will just follow up with her about how people can support her efforts. Midway is an island that we know well in sort of popular culture as being a theatre of war. I don't think a lot of people are aware of, say, Midway and Guam being another one in the Northern Pacific. The Marianas, where there were some historic battles as well, had been really the last vestiges, the reservoirs of biodiversity in the Pacific. So, Federico, come on back in. Let's.
Sorry, I just get a message saying that apologies. She's literally in the goods, so pretty bad connection. So maybe you can try to have another later on talk about Pacific Rim. Yeah.
Another time, just for astute listeners of the show, we'll be able to slap me about the face and throw some egg on my face, because while I was talking to Steph Burrell earlier, I had a bit of a chuckle because Steph mentioned mongooses. And I went, Steph, mongooses are in Africa. I had no idea that there were feral populations of mongooses on islands in the Pacific. Is a mongoose an animal that you've had to deal with?
No. What's the worst invasive being in Mexican islands are feral cats and mice, like in rodents, rats, black rats especially, and like in islands elsewhere. And so that's what we're an NGO that it's based in Mexico. We're based in northern Mexico, like in the border with the US, in the California Peninsula. And we've been working towards removing invasive mammals, particularly from the different islands. And most of it has been done to protect seabird colonies, for instance, or other fauna species that mostly are endemic to the islands. So we've been doing this for the past bit more like 22 years or so. And we started learning and getting all the experience from Australia and New Zealand, and the ones that are at the top with these issues of removing invasive species. And then we have moved along throughout these years. And so far, it's been good. We've cleaned like 30 different islands from invasive mammals on Mexico. And there's about half of other islands that we should treat eventually. As we progress, islands are getting bigger with complex issues like the ones that have introduced mice. They also have native mouse populations. So different issues that we have to deal with eventually.
So that's a very, very difficult problem to solve, I would imagine. How do you differentiate between a native rodent and an invasive rodent? And what are the strategies that you're using to, well, firstly, to target one and to only eradicate that chosen one?
Yeah, I mean, we haven't done so. It's been done elsewhere, but it's quite complex because you have to. In the US, they did it on Anacapa Island, which is in the Alaskan chain. And what they did is they caught an X number of the native mouse population and do the eradication as an aerial broadcast or a bait to target the invasive mouse. And then eventually they release the native. So that's one of the approach that you should do when you can do an eradication when there's no non-targets that could potentially eat the bait.
So that introduces the complexity that you need to, one, be able to efficiently capture the native rodent, and then they have to be adaptable to being held in captivity because it's an extended period of time. The eradication takes more than one breeding season. So you have to learn all about capturing and maintaining them. And then will reintroduction be successful. So it's an extremely complex undertaking. Federico, luckily, I love when we do an interview and it overlaps the great tentacles of conservation spread all over the world. Not only have some amazing people that we've already spoken to been involved in seabird conservation, but you've worked with previous guest Mark Holdsworth and his partner Sue with their detector dog project. So can we talk about how you used detector dogs, and let's pump up Mark's tires a bit. How was Mark involved? More specifically, how are the dogs involved?
Yeah, it's been a long run and a long story with Mark and with his partner Sue Robinson. We've consulted with them for different eradication projects, especially for feral cats. We've been targeting feral cats on an island. It's a big island. It's a 13,000 hectares island in the Central Pacific off the coast of Mexico, pretty remote. It's called Socorro, within a chain of islands called it's a World Heritage Site. So we've been targeting feral cats for 5 years now. And it's because the difference that we have in Mexico with Australia and New Zealand, and that the use of bait is more complex and it's more constrained. So we can use 1080 or the different baits or the different poisons that have been developed to target feral cats. So we're doing this with traditional techniques, trapping, hunting, and the aid of detection. So that's where we consulted with them. We started working with an instructor of a canine unit here in Mexico that he used to train dogs for the police or the Navy or the military to detect explosives, drugs, etc. The usual kind of detection dog. Conservation dogs in Mexico are not a thing still, although it's growing. And so we approached him and he said, well, we want to have detection dogs to detect feral cats and scats and urine, etc., but also birds. Because on this island, Socorro, we're removing the cats because one of the most treated birds, the Townsend's chillwater, nests only on 2 islands on that archipelago. So there's about 100 pairs for the world population, and it's because of the pressure of the feral cats. The Townsends. Yes. And so we are also using the dogs to detect the burrows for the Townsend's chillwater on Socorro, for example, and as well for different seabird species on Guadaloupe Island, besides feral cats.
Now, give us an idea of the size of those 2 islands and how off the coast are they?
So if you picture like Mexico, there's the Central Pacific, like it's tropical. So from mainland Mexico to Socorro Island, it's about 600 kilometers from the coast. So it's about 2 days boat trip. It's one of the most remote archipelagos, and it's an active volcano, Socorro Island, and it's about 1,300 meters high. So it's a big island, quite remote, very difficult to get there. We have the fortunate that there's a Navy base on the island, and the Navy has been one of the most supporters of this work on providing logistics. I mean, we couldn't get there without the Navy. So that's one of the things. And the other island, Guadalupe, like North Mexico, like if you picture the Baja California Peninsula, it's about 350 kilometers west, like on the way to Hawaii. And that's why the connection for the albatrosses.
And in terms of latitude, is that sort of more closer to LA or closer to Mexico City?
It's more closer to like San Diego, for example. Yeah. Northern Mexico, let's say. Exactly. And it's the California current, productive waters around. So that's why there's so much seabirds on all this region. I mean, there's different island chains on the California Peninsula that we've been working on, first removing the invasives, but then on doing seabird work. There's petrels, auklets, chillwaters, albatrosses. And so we've been doing different types of things, from social attraction to now the translocation, particularly for Guadalupe. And we were looking ahead on doing some more work on translocations, but now between different islands in Mexico, because the invasives, particularly cats, extirpated some of the breeding colonies on these islands.
Okay, so I know very little about the albatross of the North Pacific. So Black-footed Albatross is your icon species. Would that be fair to say?
It would be the Lysan. So in Mexico, we have 4 Lysan albatross colonies. One, and the most important one, is Guadalupe Island with about like 1,500 breeding pairs. It's not big, it's not much, but it's one of the biggest in the Eastern Pacific and one of the most with the highest breeding rates because it's a growing population. Then, like, we go a bit further south of Guadaloupe Island, and there's another island chain and there's about like 15 to 20 pairs on that island. And then we go back to we have colonies on two different islands there, on Clarion and San Benedicto. So talking about albatrosses, like Mexico would be, icon species would be the Lysan albatross. And then the Blackfoots, we haven't confirmed yet, but in the past, there's records that they nested on an island called San Benedicto, which is also in the revegetation. And they have tried to nest on Guadaloupe, but they haven't been successful because of different reasons. But the one that we have been recording more, it's the pressure from feral cats, because we have feral cats on the island. So that's why now that we are approaching on finishing the category, it's that we started moving ahead with the translocation project with Pacific Rim and from the US and Mexico collaborate.
Now, do you have any other breeding albatross species in the Mexican territories?
No, that's it. I mean,
That's
there's distribution for the short-tailed albatross, but there's no breeding colonies. So it's just a license and hopefully soon the Blackfoots.
Okay. What is the estimated population of breeding of Lysan albatross in Mexico? Throughout
Mexico, it would be like 1,600 breeding pairs throughout the 4 colonies. So it's a small, but it's growing population. Yeah, actually, it's interesting because Lindsay and Eric from Pacific Rim, that they have been working on Hawaii, the epicenter or one of the epicenters for license, and they see the opportunity that Guadaloupe Island brings. And they think that in let's say 20, 30 years, it might be the epicenter for at least license and black because of the size of the island, the height, it's 1,400 meters high, and the space they have for breeding.
Federico, it's beautiful when I hear a guest say the population is increasing.
Yeah.
Well, I'm just casting my mind back. I think it may well be a confident first. I think we've had a few people who are thinking that the populations are increasing. Certainly, I know that Mark Holdsworth, as we mentioned earlier, with a lot of his work, has seen habitats being swiftly repaired. And perhaps we can talk about that in the areas where you've been successful in removing invasive species. How quickly does the habitat bounce back?
It's quite remarkable that it's almost immediate. And the whole story of it's quite a nice one because it's probably one of the crown jewels as island-wise in Mexico. And so, but it had lots of impacts. It had feral goats for about 150 years that they were left there by whalers and sealers in the past century. And so the first we did was removing the goats, like in the mid-2000s, between 2003 and 2005. And we had an endemic forest, pines, the Monterey pine. It's endemic to a variety of it. It's endemic to Guadaloupe Island. But we also have an endemic palm, an oak, a cypress. It was an endemic forest that the goats almost wiped out from the island. So that's why we removed them. The year after removing the goats and declaring success on that eradication, you could see the seedlings popping back. And what we had was like 220 adult trees remaining. And by now we have more thousands of them resprouting and big enough now to sustain a population. So that was kind of the first step on restoring Guadaloupe Island. And then it came, we have to do more. And so we started doing active restoration for vegetation. So we've been reforesting with the endemic species or doing fire prevention measures or soil erosion management, different issues that tie with the different to provide or improve habitat for not for the island itself, but also for some of the seabirds that used to use the vegetation as a habitat. So we haven't found it yet, but there's a seabird that it's extirpated from Guadaloupe, probably extinct in the wild, that it used to nest high up on the island within the forest. So we still have hopes that eventually, as the improvement of the forest goes, we will find it eventually. So the different things still happening and to this on that island.
Now, Federico, we've got another beautiful crossover and tie-in, and I'll go off on a bit of a tangent. You mentioned the Monterey pine, which is Pinus radiata. Now, that is very, very familiar to Australian listeners.
Yes.
And I'm going to presume New Zealand listeners. I'm sure it was introduced in New Zealand as well. And we're used to seeing it as either a sort of roadside escapee or grown as a plantation species in a monoculture. And we also have a number of cypress, which have been used extensively as farm trees. So we're used to seeing these big, massive cypress standing alone, isolated in a paddock. Give us an idea of what a mixed conifer forest, cypress and Pinus radiata, looks like in its regrowth form, because I imagine mostly you're seeing regrowth now.
Yeah, and it's amazing. It's a picture you wanna frame it forever, because it's not only a mix of cypress and pines, but then you get an endemic palm as well. So if you picture Guadaloupe Island, it has like a seahorse figure, and if you go to the northern ridge where the pine forest is, there's a mix of the pine forest with junipers, with cypresses, with the palms, all either native or endemic species. And it's amazing to see how the recovery is going. You see trees that before they were a seedling and the goats would eat it, and now you have 2, 3, 4 meter high juveniles now. Even some of them 6 years old or so, now producing cones. So yeah, I mean, what you could see on Australia or New Zealand, I used to live in New Zealand for a while. And yeah, I mean, it was like, there's so much here and so less there that it was quite a contrast.
So, dear listener, let me reiterate that. We're used to seeing that monoculture for the Pinus radiata. Just imagine you have junipers, and Northern Hemisphere listeners, think about this. Your subarctic forests, junipers, cypress, Pinus radiata, and palm trees. I mean, that's a beautiful image. I hope I'll publicly ask you this now. Send me through a couple of photos, if you could, of that habitat, perhaps in it, if there's any remnant sort of old growth forest, and then some of your revegetation, and people can have a look while they're having a listen. Sure. I'm blown away by that. I just had this idea, never having been to Mexico, I just thought there'd be some palm trees, there'll be a whole lot of that sort of scrubby, heathy, deserty kind of vegetation would be consistent on the islands with palm fringe beaches. So you've just shows I should have done my research.
No worries, Grant. It's quite a place. I mean, you have lots of, because you can go from sea level to 1,400 meters high. So, and because of the height and probably what sustains that vegetation on Guadalupe, it's most of the time that you are above 1,000 meters, you have pretty dense fog on the island, and you feel even being like above the clouds, literally.
So do you have, like, when we think of a cloud forest and we think of rainforest, and I know New Zealanders will be, particularly South Islanders, will be used to living in the cloud, in the fog. Are there epiphytic plants that are also growing in that sort of fog level? Like, is there its own little microclimate and distinct habitat at that level?
Yes, there is. There's so much to know still from Guadalupe, but there's probably some endemic lichens and musk, and yeah, I mean, there's quite a rain, most like a cloud forest. But yeah, it's like that. Yeah, it's probably like a scenery from the South Island, although the trees doesn't go right to the beach, right?
And with those mosses and lichens, does it have you got a similar situation like they do in the southern US with the mosses and other epiphytes hanging down from established trees and that sort of stringy vegetation? Do you have anything like that? Or?
Not that much. No, it's more like, either the mosques or the lichens on the rocks below the trees or on the trunk. But yeah, not so much. Yeah.
Okay, amazing. Tell me a bit more about the human effects on the islands that you're working on. Are there resident human populations on the islands? How big are they? And what kind of industry human activity happens day to day on the island?
Yeah, we have like a myriad of scenarios. So we have, like, if you think, probably most of you, if you think in Mexico, you will remember Cancun or the kind of the Caribbean side of Mexico. And so there's a couple of islands there like Isla Mujeres or Cozumel that they are quite touristy. So they have a big human population, let's say, like, I don't know, like 100,000 people or so in, for example. But then from those type of human populations, most of the islands, they just have like 100 or less inhabitants that are mostly fishermen that live on the island, and they, like in the North Pacific, like off the place I'm at in the Baja California Peninsula, it's mostly artisanal fishermen for abalone and lobster. And there's another connection with Australia and New Zealand. We have the red lobster as well here in California, or the abalone as well, like the paua in New Zealand. And and most of the communities on the islands, they have stewards. They have been stewards for this conservation work. I mean, they are connected most to the marine environment because they depend on it, but they have on doing this conservation work. So we have different cases where the community, like there's an island called San Benito that we have been working with fishermen cooperative for about 15 years. And they knew about the invasive species. They knew about biosecurity, for example. And so because they shift from different seasons, they literally move from one island to another with everything, mattresses, fridges, you name it. And so they introduce an endemic mouse species from one island to a different island where they also visit. And they were the ones that approached us and said, hey, we think we did this and we want to solve it because we know it's not right. So that's why we started working with them. And then we did that mouse eradication from that. And especially because that island is probably the epicenter for seabirds within the North Pacific here in Mexico. There's like 2 million birds every year there. So that's why it was important before the population of mouse kind of colonized the island.
I don't want to put you on the spot too much and assume that you're a historian, but the fisher folk that we're talking about, the abalone and lobster fishermen, to the best of your knowledge, are they indigenous populations or were they originally translocated from the sort of greater, wider Mexican community over time?
There's a mix. There's a couple of islands that there's some historic indigenous populations from the Baja California Peninsula. So there's an island that it has even a name on indigenous language. And so it's a mixture. The other ones are communities that from mainland, they moved to the islands, but they have been there for the past 70 or so years. So it's kind of not indigenous, but they have been there for a while. And they have provided a service for taking care of the islands and having human presence, etc. Yeah,
absolutely. And of course, you mentioned earlier that the Navy are great supporters of your work. And of course, historically, defence installations on islands are a thing. They have been a thing, they are a thing, and they will remain a thing. So you always have to work around that. And historically, people have always had to work around naval ports and global shipping. I mean, that's just life. I was encouraged that you talked about fisher folk and we didn't talk about long lines or anything like that. So are the fishery pressures that are so familiar to seabird lovers in the more southerly reaches of the Pacific, are they an issue for Mexico and adjoining Central American territories?
For Mexico, that's still a pending issue to know. And from working on the islands for 20 years and even with the fishing community, I mean, there's obviously industrial fisheries within Mexico, like tuna, it's important, sardine, anchovy. Within the Gulf of California, for example, there's probably in Mexico the one interaction between seabirds and fisheries that it's kind of being well documented. It's within the Gulf of California with the sardine fishery. But like in the Pacific side of it, for like albatrosses, there's no studies yet. We're trying to move ahead and see what we can, find. And now with all the information from Global Fishing Watch and the kind of fishing pressure. And so we want to see what's the interaction between seabirds and fisheries within the North Pacific in Mexico. From a hunch, we think it's low, but we have to do the studies to see, because there's few longline fisheries within the North Pacific, like for sharks, and especially for sharks. So that's something we have to still find out. But yeah, I mean, you probably like a proxy, you find on different islands birds with either the hawks and the lions and etc. And we don't find that much in the islands in northern Mexico. Like for Guadaloupe, where we have the biggest albatross population for license, there's not much kind of signs of fisheries interactions. Even plastics as well. There's so much less plastics in the sea where they feed, like the California current, as opposed to the ones on Hawaii. So that's why when we talked with Lindsay and Eric from Pacific Rim Conservation and others, that's why we saw the opportunity for Guadaloupe Island. So less plastics, probably no fishing pressure, higher islands, so no sea level rise impacts, and eventually in a few years, I hope, no invasive mammals. So you have the opportunity, and that's why we took it.
That's a really good news story, isn't it, for all of your seabird species and any other migratory species that use the islands as well as endemics. I didn't get the chance to speak at length with Steph this time about plastic pollution, but Steph had talked to me in the very first episode of The Bird Emergency specifically about plastic and pollution in the oceans and ingestion of plastics being a massive issue for seabirds and albatross, well, particularly. That's really good news if that is not a major problem for the populations on your offshore islands.
Yeah, I mean, we've done just a few studies about it, not detailed ones. But yeah, I mean, you can see what reaches into the islands around. And I think it's because the site where we are, the California current goes from Alaska to the south, and there's lots of uprising as well, upwelling, and so very productive waters. And I think it's because of the currents that there's no kind of concentration of plastics. And also because of the places where the seabirds forage. They don't have to go pretty far within the Pacific Ocean, because there's the California current that provides near the coast lots of food as well. So we've been also doing some tagging mostly for albatrosses from Guadaloupe and from Pelago. And that's what they do. I mean, if you contrast that with what Hawaiian albatrosses do, that they go further from north from Hawaii, in Guadaloupe, they mostly tend to feed around because the food is there right next to the island. So that's another interesting thing, that it's an advantage with.
So we'll just sort of summarize the differences in approach for eradication between the sub-Antarctic populations and the lower temperate populations that we were talking about with Steph. And that's mostly been baiting for invasive mammals, and then in a limited sense, manual reduction of invasive plant species, and then a follow-up with trapping and using some dogs. But your techniques had to be very different because you have not been able to use the rodenticides, the poisons, aerial baiting, and those kind of methods that have been done. So you've been manually removing
Yeah, I mean, for rodents, we have used, especially for big islands that we have treated, and it's the same kind of as what they are doing now on Gulf Island and what they do on Marion. So it's inside. So we have done that in about probably 10 islands to target either black rats or introduce house mouse. So that's the way to do it, because otherwise it's impossible.
That's why I wanted to step through it, because you did mention that you had some difficulties about being able to use the rodenticides. So I just wanted that clear for listeners and of course for me, because I'm a dummy.
No worries. Yeah. I mean, what we haven't used is for removing feral cats, baiting. All the eradications we have conducted is being kind of trapping, hunting, and using detection dogs.
Okay. Now, with using the rodenticides, do you set up bait stations so that birds don't have access to them at all, or is it done with the aerial dropping method, which of course is far more cost effective?
We have used both. On islands that have been small enough to treat it with bait stations, we have used that. We have used manual dispersion of bait. So there's there's 3 islands in the Gulf of Mexico. It's an archipelago called Scorpion Reef, and it had different populations of black rats and house mouse, but they were small enough, like less than 50 hectares, that we treated them by hand with the same principle of put the bait for every rodent on the island. So it's the same principle, but you do it by hand. And so that involved not bait stations, but people walking like a barrier across the island throwing bait. And then we have the other big one, islands, that we have treated with the aerial.
Okay. Now, you mentioned that's like what we would call an emu walk, an emu parade of people lined up and doing the reverse of a line search, broadcasting and then broadcasting the rodenticides. After the rodents have been killed, do you then follow up and remove the carcasses so that scavengers can't get them and that there isn't, or that they don't wash away after heavy rain and then get into another food chain?
Well, normally, because of the biology of rodents, they tend, if they consume the bait and they feel ill, they normally go to their burrows. So contrary to what people might think, that you go to an island that has been treated with a rodenticide, you'll find carcass all over the place. And it's normally not the case. I mean, you find the one or two, but most of them go within the burrows, and that's where they pass away. So it's normally not the case. So yeah, I mean, they eventually deintegrate and comes back to the land.
Yeah. There wouldn't be anyone silly enough to think that there were dead carcasses all over the island, would there? Actually, look, in all honesty, I had thought that perhaps you would have both situations where, of course, some of the rodents are back in their burrows, but then I would have thought that some would be still out, maybe foraging or doing rodent things and dying above ground. So thanks for pointing that out, because I certainly had. And again, I said something to Steph that I wondered about the skewers and other scavengers picking up carcasses, but that's now I have a much better understanding that.
Yeah, I mean, those centrally happen. I mean, you have to be very careful on the planning of these types of projects, because normally there's non-targets involved. So yeah, you have to do for going into rodent eradication, you have to really plan ahead and probably study the ecosystem for we've done even 3 or 4 years before implementing, because you want to know who eats the bait and how it goes through the food chain. So you do different kind of experiments to see who eats it, and then the ones that eat it, who eats them. And so you kind of break down what will be your side impacts or your side effects, and you want to minimize them. So we have had cases that with this endemic mouse from a different island was introduced by the community. There was an endemic sparrow on that archipelago that consumed the bait. So that was a non-target that we had to do something about it. So we did the studies for the population first to see if it was endemic species, if it was a population specific to an island or the archipelago. And so at the end, we decided to do a captive breeding program while we did the baiting. And so we kept, it was probably 150 or 200 sparrows within a captive place in the island. And we released them 6 months after doing the aerial baiting.
Now, again, a difference between your Mexican situation, Northern Pacific ecosystems compared to the sub-Antarctic that we've talked about. When we talk about scavengers, or when I talk about scavengers, we're talking about skewers, petrels, gulls, and whatnot. In the Northern Pacific and in the islands, have you got other raptors that occur on the islands you're working in?
Yes, we have some. Forgot the names in English now. Of course, we have gulls, of course, and probably most of the non-targets have been gulls on most of the projects. But raptors, we have hawks and falcons and things, small kind of eagle hawks. And
owls?
Yes, as well.
Yeah. We often don't talk about the owls, but rodents are largely nocturnal, and so of course we've got that opportunity for the non-target species to be affected. Federico, tell us a little bit about your organisation. How long has it been going? What other works does it do? And when did you join them?
For sure. We mostly focus on island restoration work within Mexico. So we were founded in 1998, and I joined the group in 2007, especially for an area baiting project on the Gulf of California. We've been mostly our specialty is doing restoration, and the first step is to remove invasive mammals. So that's one of the, the most of the things we have been doing. But we also do restoration work after removing the species. So we've been restoring seabird colonies. We've been restoring habitat through vegetation restoration. And we also work a lot with government to produce policies, public policies, instruments, protected areas, World Heritage sites to protect the islands within Mexico. And also a lot of work of environmental education and outreach with the communities on the islands. So it's a really comprehensive view about achieving sustainability on the island and working with the local communities and with the government to achieve that. So it's been more than 20 years. And so far, we still have some islands to work with removing invasives, but now we're also focusing more on what happens next on the islands, like what extra restoration work is needed, like for Guadaloupe with vegetation, or for the Baja California Pacific Islands to restore extirpated seabird colonies through social attraction, then moving on into removing invasive plants. That it's totally another issue. You would think it's easier to remove an invasive rather than a mouse population, but it's not. And so, that's what we've been doing.
All right, there's a couple of things to unpick there. Social attraction. Now, again, I spoke a long time ago, my first chat with Steph, episode 1, we talked about the lonely gannet, the story of the lonely gannet, the gannet statue that was stuck on a cliff. And so they got a clay statue, I think, of a gannet, stuck him on the hillside. If they saw passing gannets, played gannet noises, the gannets came to visit him. That was one way to bring a population back to a newly treated island. Is that how you have been doing social attraction?
Yes, that's the way. We've been putting decoys, recreating a colony artificially. So we've been using decoys of like probably 5 different species: cormorants, albatrosses, both licensed and blackfoots especially, and then broadcasting calls that we recorded on nearby islands with the breeding populations. And that's how we've been doing. And it's quite interesting because we had like 27 extirpated breeding colonies in the northern islands in northern Mexico. And so far, after removing the invasive, and it's been like probably a decade since most of those islands don't have invasive mammals, even though no seabirds have come back to nest. So that's why we started with the social attraction. And up to now, we've recovered like 85% of those extirpated colonies on these islands. So that's great news that eventually we're aiming the 100% to get those breeding colonies back. And we have even new breeding colonies of different species. It really works, social attraction.
That's a really good news story. And you mentioned how difficult it is to eradicate vegetation, invasive vegetation, compared to rodents. And that's because you just need the muscle for manual removal. It's a lot trickier to selectively apply herbicide. So I would imagine that manual removal concentrated in specific areas, is that how you do it? You would mark out a target area, get in there, manually remove it, and then frequently revisit so that you exhaust the seed bank? Is that?
Yeah, that's some of the approaches. Yeah, but then it's at the long run, it's quite costly because the seed bank, it could be years that, a lot of people power, a lot of effort, and then you have to go back again the next year after the rainy season, and eventually, you would finish, but it takes time. And then, the difficulties of using herbicide that it targets specifically the weed that you want to remove. So it's something that we're venturing in, but it's complicated. It's challenging. It can be done, but it's challenging. And then I guess what we have learned so far is that when you manually remove invasives, probably the best thing to do would be to replant or outplant natives to compete. And eventually you would get the natives spreading out and then less control to remove the weeds. But it's a never-ending job.
That's right. And I'm sure it's not, well, I might be wrong, but I'm assuming it's not your job, but that apart from organising the teams to manually remove the weed species. You also need to collect seed and maintain a seed bank or nursery for seedling stock and whatnot to replace the areas, because plants love real estate. Weeds love real estate more than everyone else. As soon as there's a clearing, as soon as there's an opportunity, as soon as there's disturbed ground, they're right back in there. So you need to give the endemic native species a chance to come back. So do you maintain a seed bank and a nursery with your group?
We do, but it's for a different approach. I mean, not to tackle, in a way it is, but it's mostly on Guadaloupe. Because of the relevance of the vegetation there, because the forest it used to do a continuum, but then because of the goats, it's now patchy distribution. So we want to bring back connectivity. So we put a nursery back on the island and then started to outplant cypress, pines, and some endemic shrubs and like Mediterranean type ecosystem vegetation that we have here, different species. And so far we've outplanted like 150,000 different seedlings of about 10 species to do that connection. And we keep on doing that on that island in particular. We are looking at that same approach on other islands, but it's a program by itself. And so you really have to have the investment, the time, the people to do it.
And that was going to be my next point, is that, well, I'll preface it by asking you a question about your team in the NGO. How many of you are there who are actually working full-time for conservation?
Yeah, we're kind of a mid-sized probably NGO. We're 45 staff. And most of it, like 80% of it, it's fieldwork, biologists, oceanographers, veterinarians, forestry background that does the conservation work on the island. And then we have, it's 45 people. And it's a team. You have to have the resources to maintain it. And especially because of the scope of the work we do, it's not regional, but it's national. So we work on islands all over Mexico. And that implies having the resources to move from here and there. And especially because island work is expensive.
And with a team of 45 and obviously academic scientific professionals, are you bolstered for specific projects by volunteers? Do you use volunteers frequently?
Not frequently. I mean, we're trying. It's been a question that it's always asked, but it's interesting how in Mexico volunteering is not that well developed and it's in different countries. But it's something we're trying to get more. I mean, the type of volunteers we have, it's more like people doing an undergrad, biology related or science related, and then they want to get the feel the need of it's a real work. And so that's the type of volunteering, but not as the wider public volunteering. I mean, there's interest, but it's also complicated to develop because of the difficulty of getting to a remote island, housing and everything.
So that leads me to the next question, because you rely on the military a lot for logistics and for transport, but do the military ever help you out with a hit on something like weed pulling?
Yeah, they do. I mean, they have aided on most of the, if not all, the aerial baiting projects that we have done. The Navy has aided a lot. I mean, we needed to take a helicopter bait to an island, and so the Navy provided the boat to do it and to take everything to the island, and even as a platform to develop the project. So they are quite deeply involved, and we're now developing with them, because we have 3 much islands that are now free of invasive mammals, that we have all these biosecurity program kind of mimicking what you have in Australia and New Zealand, to avoid new introductions or reintroductions of the species that we removed. And the Navy, where they have bases, they are probably the best supporters of biosecurity. And so they implement the measures, or we implement them together. There's another actor involved as well, which is the Protected Areas Commission. So all of the islands in Mexico are federally protected. So there's a regulation and a management program, etc. And so this commission is the one that enforces regulations. And one of those is to avoid the incursion of invasive species. So it's something that we have developed over the years, and it's this, like interinstitutional collaboration among agencies and the communities and as an NGO.
again, another part of a good news story. Now, Federico, have you got a little bit more time? Because you mentioned that you had been in New Zealand for a while. So can we talk a little bit specifically about your career?
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
I mean, it's we also have the view we have, or the vision we have for what we do in Mexico is to have the local capacities within house. So that's what we have, like this building capacities program. And what we have done, some of us, is go and have a postgraduate study elsewhere where there's relevance because of invasive species and management. And so some of us did that. And that's why I went to New Zealand with my partner, that she's the one that it's been working with Sue and Mark, particularly Luciana. And she did a PhD in New Zealand, so I came along. And then while I was there, I started doing a master's in the University of Auckland. And it was most related to co-management and fisheries on islands, especially the ones for abalone and lobster. And then, we lived there for about 4 years in New Zealand, which was a great time, and we really enjoyed it. And then after finishing, we came back and rejoined the group and keep on working. And so that's a way we've been doing it, to develop staff and personnel and get the capacities with it.
That's great. I mean, one thing I'm learning by doing the show, Federico, is how small and interconnected in one way the global conservation community is, and that the academic community is a very, very generous community, with not only sharing knowledge, but also sharing resources when possible, and really helping each other out, because, of course, the end game is just protecting what we've got and repairing what we can. Tell me a little bit about your experience in New Zealand. Did you see a lot of New Zealand? What were the things that, looking back now, that you see as really significant in the differences between the environments you work in Mexico, your offshore islands, and what you saw in New Zealand?
Well, the first thing is probably the connection that New Zealanders have with their environment. That's amazing, because it's not the people that are working to protect the environment, but it's mostly every New Zealander has that connection. And that's quite neat. I don't know why it is, but it might be because they depend so much on their environment and natural resources, and they're so interconnected. That's something I really always felt, that it's something that in Mexico more of the wider public. I mean, it's growing and growing as we speak, but that's something that I really was always amazed by New Zealanders. And I mean, the scenery and the places, the magical places they have, and the islands as well, and the approach also for doing conservation and restoration work, serious things, and that long-term vision of now pest-free New Zealand, that's amazing to follow.
Yeah, that's something that, as an Australian, I'm very envious of the efforts. I mean, to have successive governments of different colours to be so committed to eradicating invasive species and putting really significant resources. And of course, conservationists and environmentalists will always say it's not enough. But as a proportion of national spending, it's a lot more than what we do here. And I'm pretty sure that Mexico would be a long way behind, but hopefully the trajectory goes up. At the risk of us both being amateur anthropologists and sociologists, and even psychologists, Federico, tell us a bit about how conservation generally is viewed in Mexico, because, of course, I sit here as a white man in a colonized country, sitting in a very privileged position in a socio-economic environment that is significantly different to a great many Mexicans. How is conservation growing? You mentioned that it's not as significant as you found it in New Zealand, and that the connection to the natural world is not quite as great, but it's growing. Tell us a bit about the background of conservation, let's say in your living memory. I guess that probably casts back to about the late 80s and 90s. Tell us how you think conservation has become more important in Mexico.
Yeah, I mean, it's evolving, definitely. And I think there's kind of a mixture of the local communities, indigenous communities. They are quite connected to the environment and to protect the environment they depend on. And probably what's been growing lately. So the local communities, the indigenous communities are quite connected. So probably the change or the shift has been going with the middle income society, the ones that are on cities, probably afar from a natural place, etc. That it's now with the changes which we're seeing, and also the discourse about conservation and its importance and how intrinsically connected is everything with environment, it's now being more relevant. So conservation work is normally, at least for Mexico, it's viewed as, if you do conservation work, it's like, what an amazing job, and you are there in magical places and doing a difference. But now it's also about the wider public support that work. It's not just like cheering up, but it's how can I do a change? What can I do to make a difference? And that's something that it's already happening here. And people is becoming more and more aware, and also, how could you say it, asking it from the government to support that type of work. And as you said, I mean, depending on the color, it hasn't to be the party that is on the government. They all have to support this type of work. And that's probably something that it's also growing as well. And they are already incorporating into politics. So that's...
Yeah, look, I know that talking politics in some parts of the world is a dangerous thing. But again, I come from a Western colonial perspective. Now, you come from a Latin American colonial perspective, but with significant Indigenous issues. On this one, in Australia, in my sort of voting lifetime from the 80s to now, conservation and environment, climate change has sort of drifted from a top 5 issue down to a top 10 issue for voters. Where do you think conservation particularly and climate change generally is in the minds of the political activist, the voter, and the politicians in Mexico?
Yeah, I mean, at the moment, probably I could say...
Top 10?
Yeah, probably top 10. Although, yeah, I mean, it's also about who thinks conservation really is, or how you implement it and how you make a difference. So, but yeah, it would be probably top 10. I mean, it's an issue. It's discussed. It's probably not so much investment on it. But then what I always say, it also depends on us, the citizens, people that are on NGOs and that can make a difference, that mostly than, recriminating to the government for not doing things. It's probably making those alliances and try to see how you can make a difference with them, with their help. And that's been kind of an approach that we as an NGO have done. I mean, it doesn't matter who is in government, we can do things together and we can help have better island ecosystems in Mexico if we collaborate and work together. So I guess it's depending on how you approach it. And at least our approach is always positive and always try to make a difference, no matter who is.
Well, Federico Mendez, look, I'm so pleased that we have been able to have a good news story for World Albatross Day 2021. Now, if somebody wants to help your group with their efforts, what's the most effective way for them to do that? Where can they contact you? Is there a way for people to donate if they are offshore? And if they're in Mexico or in Central America, can they reach out and actually get involved?
Yeah, I mean, for sure, they can reach out. We have our webpage and social media. It's in Spanish. So, I mean, but you can find us as Conservacion de Islas. That's Facebook, Twitter, you name it. And we don't have like a donation program, but I mean, you can get in touch and see what we can do together. Either it's a donation that we normally don't do, but volunteering or at least just chatting about conservation work in Mexico and exchange ideas, it's great.
What's your preferred social media avenue? What are you most active on, and what does the group focus on most?
We are mostly active on Facebook and Twitter. And and so we publish the news about what's going on and what we've been doing as well.
Yeah. Well, but you know what it's like. Oh, well,
Yeah.
Hopefully I'll have it all up next week. But yeah, next week never comes, because I'm always talking to amazing fellas and men and women like yourself. So yeah, really good. Federico, thanks for doing the good work. Thanks for keeping the momentum up. Thanks for looking after albatrosses. And thanks for looking after all the other seabirds and the sparrows, the owlets, the falcons, everything else that hang around on the Mexican islands. Of course,
Thanks.
I'll link to everything that I possibly can. And I think Federico promised to send me some pictures of some amazing revegetation and some old growth Pinus radiata and cypress forests and juniper berries. So hopefully I can share that with you very soon. Dear listener, happy World Albatross Day 2021. This is the Bird Emergency. I'm Grant Williams. Thanks so much for listening.